Hey everybody, I'm Scott Allen Miller. Today on Sam IT, we are going to continue our RAID series, and we're going to look at RAID 10. Today, this is 2017, RAID 10 is the most important RAID level for the majority of businesses or workloads. We often refer to the term OBR 10 as the new standard for what most workloads should use. That stands for one big RAID 10, meaning a single RAID 10 array that all of your data sits on, at least within a single system. RAID 10 has kind of hit the sweet spot over time to make up the majority of what people need. It's easy for us to say that RAID 10 is the de facto standard and the starting point, and people tend to interpret that as something they should always use then, but that's not what that means. It means if you have no idea what you need, start with RAID 10. It's the least likely to be wrong, but it could still be wrong. RAID is complex. You have to make choices. You have to look at your needs, but don't start from a bad spot. It's like anything in life. You have to have a starting point or you're just lost, and you want your starting point to be reasonable and likely to be a good choice. It may not be the best choice, but you don't want it to be a horrific choice. If we were to make RAID 0 the de facto standard, for example, a lot of people would use it not realizing that it's completely risky and doesn't meet their needs in any way whatsoever. That would be bad. We don't want to lead people down that path. So we start with RAID 10 because it's both very safe and very likely to be either the best choice or one of the best choices. If you get it wrong, chances are you've not gotten it very wrong, and you're wrong in a way that involves accidentally spending a little bit too much money rather than accidentally putting your workload at extreme risk. That's the kind of failure we like. We can predict how bad it can be, and often we accept the risk up front. So for example, you may spend $1,000 on your disks instead of $800 on your disk for a waste of $200, but it's only a waste so much because compared to any other array level, it's going to be slightly faster and slightly safer that you would get with the same money. So you're mitigating the $200 loss by some amount. How much? We don't know. $2, $20, $150, we don't know. But at some point, it's $200 minus these other benefits. So that's what we call a really soft fail. Whereas if you were to use RAID 0, you may have cut the cost quite a bit, $500 instead of $1,000, but the risk to your data may easily be millions of dollars, and then you've made a really horrific decision thinking that de facto meant that's where you should start. Alright, all that aside, RAID 10 is great, but it doesn't mean it's always what you use. No one is saying that. Never repeat anything of that sort. It is simply a great starting point. Now, what is RAID 10? RAID 10 is the most common nested RAID level. That means one type of RAID on top of another. At the lowest level, touching the physical disks, we have RAID 1 pairs. Traditional RAID 1, normal RAID 1, nothing weird about it whatsoever. And just like any RAID 1, we assume it's a two-way mirror. That's two disks, one copied to the other. But it can be more. It could be 3- or 4-way mirroring, whatever. You can just keep adding. Nobody does that, but you can. Nothing about RAID 10 actually implies that it must be just two-way. So if you needed a very large, extremely safe RAID 10, you could do so. That is your option. Then on top of those RAID 1 mirrors, we have a single RAID 0 stripe that turns all of those RAID 1s into a single high-performance array by combining the capacity and the performance of all of them together. This combination has a couple of advantages. One, it's incredibly simple. There aren't as many moving parts as it sounds, so even though RAID 10 does have this nested array thing, it is still dramatically, mathematically simpler than even a basic RAID 5, let alone a RAID 6 or a RAID 7. So it has a mathematical advantage of being very, very simple. The CPU has to do extremely little to make your RAID 10 work really efficiently. It also breaks up failure domains so that should any given disk fail, only one of the mirrors needs to recover, the others are not impacted. This is great for a lot of reasons. Partially, that your CPU doesn't get very busy during a recovery operation, leaving it free to handle other things, unlike something like RAID 5, where typically when you're recovering, your CPU gets awfully busy trying to recover because it has a lot of hard math to do. There's no hard math in RAID 10 because RAID 0 and RAID 1 don't do any actual math. They're just copies and stripes. They are simple. So RAID 10 is generally pretty easy to understand, and you can get as large as you want to go because you can simply always add more RAID 1 pairs. The beauty of RAID 10 is that individual RAID 1s are so incredibly resilient that even though we're using a RAID 0 on top, it doesn't make for a very dangerous scenario until you're getting into enormous sizes, maybe more than 24 disks, and even then you have to look at your overall picture. Maybe you have really safe disks, maybe you have really good environmental conditions, you could theoretically go quite a bit larger than that. And of course the size of your disks always matters because the larger the disk, the larger the recovery time, regardless of the type of array you have. So really big disks always pose more risk than small disks. It's that easy. So RAID 10 is simple to understand. RAID 1 on the bottom, RAID 0 on top. Its risk is low. Every failure domain is limited to the individual RAID 1s. As long as none of your RAID 1s fails, your RAID 10 is safe. It is a de facto standard. It is the place to start when you're looking at any given workload. Always assume you have to prove why you don't want RAID 10 instead of trying to prove that you do need it. Unless you can prove that something else is better, assume that RAID 10 makes sense. With the known caveat that in situations where your capacity does not go past the needs of a single disk, that RAID 1 can be seen as a subset of RAID 10, where the RAID 0 stripe is only 1 unit large, so it's perfectly acceptable to use RAID 1 when we say start with OBR 10, because that's simply a matter of sizing, not a matter of changing the guidelines. I know that gets a little bit complex, but if you think about it, it makes sense in the broad scope of mathematically applying rules to these things. So hopefully that explains why RAID 10 is what it is, why we like it, how to approach it, and we're going to be delving into all these reliability questions and when different things make sense in a future video, but it's important to know that RAID 10 really is, it's simple and it's where you want to start. And of course, because of the way the RAID 0 works, we get increased capacity with each pair that we add. So RAID 1s on their own don't get bigger. And the more disks you add, they just get safer, but they don't get bigger from a capacity standpoint. But RAID 10, because of that RAID 0 stripe on top, is able to get larger and larger. So we can get very large capacities off of our RAID 10s quite safely. But we always give up, because of the RAID 1 pairs under the hood, we're always giving up 50% of our capacity, so we have to buy 20 disks to get the capacity of 10 because of that mirroring. But that mirroring is what keeps us safe. Our safety grows linearly, unlike logarithmically, like we get with parity RAID arrays as they grow in size. And our performance of RAID 10 is very, very good because we're built on such basic building blocks. We get, as we do with all RAID levels, we get roughly 100% of the read performance of all of our disks, but our write performance is kept at 50%, which is the best of all of our RAID levels for normal workloads. But we're going to get into that because performance of RAID is a really complex subject, and we cannot simply distill it as much as we all want to, just like with risks. Everything in RAID is complex. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe, put your comments below, and as always, you can sponsor us on Patreon.